Hey everyone, it's patch 3.23 Affliction, and today I want to talk about all the upcoming changes to the next December league. Now, this league is going to be an absolute banger. This is going to be one of the single best seasons of Path of Exile that GGG have ever made. In my opinion, this patch is going to easily be an 8 or a 9 out of 10, and I have very, very high hopes for what is going to come. So the first thing that we should talk about is going to be the new league mechanic. This is going to be a roguelike feature where you go into a cave that leads you to the Wildwood, and inside the Wildwood, you will have a limited resource of wisps, which allow you to traverse the fog to find different rooms that might either have enemies or vendors or bosses inside of them. While you're doing this, you can find other different colors of wisps, and once you leave the Wildwood, you have those wisps applied to the rest of the zone, giving you increased quantity, magic find, and increased currency from select mobs. Basically, think of the reward for finishing the Wildwood as a sentinel blast across your whole map on some random enemies. This could also potentially target the boss itself, and the different colored wisps could all target the boss at the same time, meaning that not only will your boss be very difficult, but also be very, very rewarding if you actually do kill it. Now, outside of random loots, the main draw to actually doing the Wildwood is going to be the new Wildwood Ascendancy classes. That's right, we're getting new Ascendancy classes. The interesting thing about this is they will effectively be sub-ascendancies that can be added onto any current ascendancy. This is not a new class. This is not something that you have to choose over your current ascendancy. This is something that you're currently going to get on top of everything you currently have. And these new ascendancies are going to be very interesting. I will have a video that's going to deep dive these ascendancies that is going to come out after this video, but I'll give a quick overview of these just so you know what you can expect. So first we have the Warden. The Warden is going to mostly revolve around a new mechanic called tinctures. What tinctures are going to do is they're going to be permanent flasks that apply to your weapons, meaning this is going to work with any melee build and any bow build. You have to actually attack with a weapon. And these are going to take up a flask slot, and they're going to give you permanent buffs effectively. The top roll is going to be what the flask is always going to come with, and the rolls in the middle will just be random, meaning you can potentially find some really interesting ones. The nice thing about this ascendancy is you have this Nature's Concoction, which makes it so any flasks adjacent to your tinctures have 30% increased effect, leading to some potentially powerful combos here. Next up, we have the Warlock. Now, the Warlock is going to potentially be more of a niche ascendancy choice. You have some interesting curses that you're going to have access to, one in particular being Pacify, which makes it so after a certain duration, you are just immune to damage from enemies that you have cursed with it. But the most interesting part is going to be the left side of it. First, we have Ascendancies, which is effectively blood magic. This makes it so you have no mana and your life acts as your mana. And you have Crimson Power, which makes it so you have no energy shield, and any energy shield scaling that you get is instead applied to your life. Meaning that we can very easily see characters with 50, 60,000 life in this upcoming league. The reason this is interesting is because we also have a new ascendancy, Cannibalized Faith, which is effectively Archmage, but for life scaling. Spells you cast gain added physical damage equal to 75% of life cost. So this means that we can potentially see characters with a lot of life, and we potentially have a completely new way of scaling spells. Lastly, which is I think the ascendancy most people are going to be interested in, is going to be the Wildwood Primalist. Now, the main draw of the Primalist is going to be the 3 sockets on the left side of the ascendancy. These sockets can be filled in with charms, and these are going to be items that you can buy from vendors inside the Wildwood. And these charms just have a mishmash of 2 random ascendancy nodes from anywhere in the game put together. And there's nothing that currently says you cannot have multiple of these. So if I wanted to, I can fill all 3 of these sockets with 3 of these, giving me effectively 3 profane blooms at the same time. This can lead to some seriously overpowered stuff, and it's going to lead you to new opportunities that you've never had before. For example, let's say you're playing RF Jug and you never really had very good clear because you don't have any sort of access to explosions outside the Maven boots. Well, you can choose to fit 3 profane blooms into your build now and suddenly have very good clear. Basically, think of any ascendancy point that you wish you had from another class and you can now put it into your build. The last 2 things to talk about, which are going to be the major reworks for the season, is 1, Metamorph is going to be completely replaced with Ultimatum. All of the rewards from Metamorph will be migrated over in some way, so we're not losing anything other than the mechanic itself being replaced with a mechanic that a lot of people wish to return for a very, very long time, myself included. Catalysts are now going to drop from the new Ultimatum mechanic instead. And all of the uniques from Metamorph are now going to be added to the core drop table, meaning Astral Projector can now just be dropped anywhere instead of you having to farm Metamorphs for it. Everything that we know of is coming back with Ultimatum, and the biggest change here is going to be that the inscribe aspects that we have known of to be able to use to challenge Trial Master are going to instead be used to assemble a new gem, and the Trial Master will now exclusively only be accessed at the end of an Ultimatum. The last and final thing, which is going to be the core and major portion of this patch, is going to be the removal of alt quality gems from Heist and the addition of Transfigured Gems to the laboratory. Heist is getting the alt quality gems from the Grand Heist completely removed, and Heist is now going to be rebalanced and buffed to make up for the fact that alt quality gems were a very major portion of the attraction to Heist. The biggest change here is going to be that blueprints are no longer of a certain type, and you'll now find a mishmash of rewards at the end of each blueprint. The replica bases are also being massively buffed to compensate for this, and currency overall at the end of each Grand Heist is going to be massively buffed to compensate. Next up, in Laboratory, all enchants are being completely removed from the game. That means all helmet enchants, all glove enchants, all boot enchants, and all belt enchants are completely gone. Instead, the font at the end of each labyrinth will now be used to modify your gems in a certain way. Some options that they have shown have been to add experience, to change it over to a exceptional gem, which means, for example, you can turn a int gem into an enlighten. And of course, we will now be able to roll gems into the new Transfigured Gems. Now, the very cool thing about this is if you don't like an outcome, you do not have to take it. For example, if I take my arc and put it in the font and I don't like the outcomes of what would happen to it, I don't have to accept it. I can keep my arc the way it is and try again later. Now, these Transfigured Gems are basically a new take on alternative quality gems. A lot of the interesting old alt quality gems and the ones that we heavily rely on for some of the builds to work are now being reworked into the base gems themselves, while these Transfigured Gems are trying to provide a completely new playstyle to a skill that we've never really seen before. This is GGG's answer to being able to buff and nerf skills, as they don't really see a way for them to be able to numerically change things without having to change things at a later point again, just to keep up with each other. Instead, what they're going to try to do is they're going to try to provide completely new ways of playing the skills while trying to keep all of them balanced. So a good example here is the Frostbomb instability. Typically, Frostbomb has a cooldown, which doesn't allow you to spam it as much as you want, but the instability version of it completely removes the cooldown, allowing you to use Frostbomb as a main skill now. Another good example is the raise zombie of falling. Instead of you actually raising a zombie as a minion, instead what this does is it makes you summon a falling corpse that explodes as soon as it hits anything, and that corpse explosion is going to count as a minion, meaning you can scale it with minion damage. And when it explodes, it's going to do anything that a minion would do when it explodes, meaning I can summon falling zombies that trigger minion stability, and I could use that as a pseudo minion build and scale it the way I would scale any minion build. These are going to give us quite a lot of new ground for new builds, and I feel like this is a very good way to, one, change up alt quality jewels, and two, completely rework lab into something that is actually interesting to do again. GG has mentioned that we're going to get 1 to 2 for each gem, but auras and heralds are not going to receive these alt qualities. This also does mean that we are losing reservation enchants from the lab, which might make some builds a little bit weaker, but overall I feel like this is a positive change for the game. Lastly, what I want to talk about is going to be all of these skill gem changes. Now, because we are losing the helmet enchants and because we're losing alt quality gems, what GG is trying to do is they are trying to change a lot of the skills to either bake in an alt quality into the base gem or to bake in a helmet enchant that was very crucial to the skill working into the quality of the gem itself. Instead of going through all these, as there's over 200 different gem changes available in this patch, I instead decided to compile a list of everything that I personally saw as noteworthy changes to mention. We're going to talk about the winners and the losers of all this. Now, what I mean by winners are either just straight up decent or massive buffs to a skill, or a new skill that is going to potentially now be meta defining, or a really, really nice change for an already existing meta skill. For losers, I'm just mostly going to talk about skills that are basically just not usable anymore at all, as some skills have been completely nerfed and completely gutted. So let me start with the winners. I'll try to go through these as fast as I can. Arc received the lab enchant that gave it +1 chain into the quality of the gem itself, and it received a 1% base crit buff. this overall is a pretty nice buffed arc, and we might see some play with it. Bane has received 10% increased curse effectiveness, meaning if you were at least starting Bane to make money to swap into another build, you should have an easier time now. Blade Blast and Blade Fall received pretty massive buffs as well. Blade Blast received a base AoE increase, meaning that any sort of AoE increase for Blade Blast will now scale even harder, while Blade Fall has had its 50% less lingering blade from triggering the skill completely removed, meaning you can now trigger Blade Fall without any sort of penalty. At the same time, it lost its crit scaling, but also lost its less damage per volley, making it substantially better to use with Unleash, meaning you'll be able to clear packs substantially easier with Blade Fall, and then use a Blade Blast to kill anything else that remains. Blade Vortex has received a pretty hefty buff as well. It does lose its free crit scaling, but to make up for that, it now has substantially higher base damage per blade, and the quality now gives it increased hit rate, making it do 50% faster hits. This overall is a pretty big buff for Blade Vortex, and the only downside here is that if you're playing cold BB, you're now going to need to focus a little bit more on crit to crit cap. Bone Shatter is having its quality completely reworked into 1% more damage per trauma. This is going to make Bone Shatter at the early portions of a season substantially stronger until you can swap over Divergent Bone Shatter. Now the thing is, we don't know if Divergent Bone Shatter is going to live as a Transfigured Gem. If it doesn't, that does put a very heavy nerf to Bone Shatter's top end. But because we get 1% more damage per trauma baked into the default Bone Shatter, this should make up for it quite a bit if it does not exist moving forward. Burning Arrow received a 20% more ignite damage as its quality, potentially means we might see Burning Arrow as a meta skill once again. Caustic Arrow received a base area increase, meaning it'll cover a bigger zone, making Vol Caustic Arrow a little bit easier to use. Cobra Lash, I'm not really sure on this. It's gained +2 chain, and its scaling per remaining chain has increased. It's very much going to work exactly like Arc now, and this potentially might be a good skill, but we don't really know. Consecrated Path Totems have received a 10% more damage buff, so if you're playing this build already, it's now just going to be better. Crackling Lance has received an absolutely monumental buff, where it now gains 10% more damage per intensity, making its single target damage be substantially higher. Discharge has received the most fun of all buffs out of everything in these patch notes, where it now gains 15% more AoE per charge instead of 20% increase, meaning you're going to be able to do full screen discharges substantially easier. Divine Ire is now one of the best scaling abilities in the game, but they have removed its properties of being able to stack faster with more enemies around you, meaning you now need to get cast speed with Divine Ire, but the scaling is going to be more than worth it, as this is going to now apply massive ignites even easier. Explosive Arrow gained 10% more damage, as it can now apply 2 additional arrows. Very nice buff for Explosive Arrow and for anyone who likes playing that build. Herald Device has received a base area increase, meaning if you are using Herald Device as your main way of clearing, it's now going to have even bigger explosions, making your clear even better. Lightning Conduit and Orb of Storms both gained decent buffs themselves. Lightning Conduit now does more damage per shock effect, meaning it's going to scale harder, while Orb of Storms now hits more targets, meaning it'll be able to shock everything around you a little bit faster, making your Lightning Conduit a little bit better. Penance Brand has been completely reworked. Instead of it now doing a lot of tiny hits, it's now going to activate 5 times faster than previous, building up for one big explosion. Once it reaches its max stacks, it's going to release an explosion that's going to be 4 times bigger than the previous Penance Brand explosion, while also doing a substantially larger amount of damage. The base damage of a level 20 Penance Brand is now twice of an Armageddon Brand and is the highest base damage in the game, while also having the second highest effectiveness of added damage possible. This means Penance Brand will and most likely is going to be the single best Ignite League starter that you're going to be able to play in the upcoming season. This thing will scale ridiculously fast and will hit dot cap ignites very, very quickly. Poisonous Concoction received a very nice buff as well after the Flash nerf that I received 2 seasons ago, where it now also applies Wither on hit. All Purity skills gained a tiny little buff to where the quality, instead of it giving it more AoE, now gives you a little bit more resistance, making your risk capping a little bit easier. Shattering Steel and Splitting Skill have been completely redesigned to where their steel shard mechanics are completely gone. They don't exist anymore, and overall they have been buffed pretty majorly. These are most likely going to be the 2 front runners for the best melee skills for the upcoming season, and they both should feel very, very fun to play. If you're a melee enjoyer, I would very much look into guides for these 2 skills. these should be your go-to as your league starter. Golems also received a very tiny buff to where they now are losing the increased life from their quality, which is now being baked into the base skill itself, meaning golems are overall tankier, while gaining increased golem buff effect as their new quality. And lastly, Volcanic Fissure received +2 additional projectiles. This isn't really that important outside of Hate Forge, Fall, Volcanic Fissure, which this should be a pretty decent buff for. Next up, I want to move on to losers. Now, what I mean by losers is these are skills that are basically either completely dead or are going to be substantially weaker moving forward. The first one to talk about here is going to be Ethereal Knives. Now, the reason I have this on here is because the Nova enchant from Lab is completely gone. This means that Ignite EK and basically all EK builds in general will feel substantially clunkier if the Nova version of the gem is not added in as a new Transfigured Gem. If it is added as a new Transfigured Gem for Ethereal Knives, then this really shouldn't be on here anymore. But if this is not a new Transfigured Gem, then Ethereal Knives, in my opinion, is pretty much a dead skill and really will not feel as good as it has in the past. If you're looking to play Ignite EK, I really wouldn't recommend it, as the reason you'd want to play that skill is because the butter smooth mapping and having to actually aim with the skill, in my opinion, completely ruins that playstyle. Next up, we have Power Siphon for instackers. So they are completely changing how the skill works. Instead of you shooting a bunch of Power Siphons in front of you, you are now instead going to have it auto aim for you at a certain amount of enemies. This effectively means that instackers do not have a single target skill anymore, which means that Power Siphon is completely dead, potentially, depending on how the wording works. And if there is no new Transfigured Gem that gives the old Power Siphon back, then this skill and instacking in general are kind of dead for single target damage. Next up, we have Frostblades. We will get into the unique nerfs after this, but Ashes and Heat Shiver are both being nerfed pretty majorly, which are both two items that Frostblades ends up abusing quite heavily. And if that is the case, Frostblades is going to definitely be knocked down a peg. It might not necessarily mean that Frostblade is not a build anymore, but it's definitely going to be substantially bigger than it has in previous seasons. Herald of Agony is also getting a pretty major nerf, and this also goes for any sort of poison hit build that used Herald of Agony as a way to poison cap. Since Heralds are not getting Transfigured Gems as well, that means the alt quality for Herald of Agony that gave you 20% increased poison chance is also gone, meaning that you are now going to have to make up that in some other way in your build. Ice Nova is also getting nerfed, which means that we potentially might not have Cast on Crit Ice Nova anymore, as it no longer explodes on any frost bolts that you create. This also could be a possible Transfigured Gem in the future, so we'll have to see if Cast on Crit Ice Nova lives. If that is not the case, then Cast on Crit Ice Nova is completely gone. Mana Bond is for sure going to be substantially nerfed, and it potentially might just not be a build at all, as alt quality Mana Leech is completely gone from the game, meaning this build is going to massively struggle with its mana problems, and we currently don't really have a very good way of fixing this. Raise Zombies, I mean, it was already dead skill, but for some reason, GGG really wanted to kick it while it was down, and they completely removed the slam skill from the zombies, meaning all the zombies do nowadays is just auto attack. They did not even compensate the zombies in any way with any sort of buffs other than +1 maximum zombie, but that really doesn't do anything, and overall, zombies are now somehow even weaker than they were before. Now, this is a very sad one. Righteous Fire. Righteous Fire has basically been killed. Now, even if GGG is going to release a Transfigured Gem of this skill to give it its old functionality back, you can no longer league start this skill, as you will not be able to get a Transfigured Gem on league start, meaning RF is just completely dead as a league starter. What they have done here is they've completely removed the base damage of RF. Instead, they have now made it so the scaling per maximum life is now 70%. The only problem here is you need 7,200 base life to make Righteous Fire do the damage that it has in previous seasons. Unfortunately, this is a very sad day, and I honestly can't believe just how instead of just nerfing it slightly, they've just chosen to completely kill the skill. It's a very, very sad day. Moving on to Spark. Spark is losing 40% projectile speed, which is quite a lot and might finally be the final nail in the coffin for Spark being a skill that people play. On top of that, Ashes is being nerfed, and we are no longer getting the alt quality of Spark. So this could potentially mean that Spark is a completely dead skill and GG has finally killed it and people are not going to play it anymore. The last thing to mention here is that Blood and Sand is also not going to be a thing anymore, the alt quality for it, which means that Spark is potentially losing another 40% projectile speed on top of that, meaning that Spark is going to be extremely slow moving forward. Tempest Shield is also getting a slight nerf, as the alt quality of Tempest Shield is also going to be gone, which means we are not going to be able to hit 75% spell block for free with the alt quality anymore, meaning any sort of build that required this for 75% spell block is now going to need one extra passive point to make it up. Lastly, Cold Dot seems to just be completely dead and is no longer going to be a league starter. Vortex has been reworked to, instead of being instant, it now has a 0.75 cast time, which is going to feel absolutely garbage. A almost 1 second cast time is not going to feel good at all. And its damage at level 20 has been nerfed by about 40%, meaning Cold Dot is going to feel substantially weaker. The final thing to mention out of all these skill gem changes is one very big quality of life for Cyclone. It no longer has a ramp, meaning you do your full damage immediately, and this means you no longer have to scale the AoE of it anymore, and the alt quality jewel that gave you more movement speed back has now been baked into Cyclone itself, meaning if you are a cast on crit build or a cast on whatever build, you now get to move a little bit faster and don't need the alt quality gem to get faster clear speed. The last and final thing that I want to touch up on these patch notes as the super important things that you should be aware of are going to be the unique balance. There are 3 things here that stand out against everything else, and that is the Ashes nerf, the Heat Shiver nerf, and the Calm Spirit nerf. Ashes completely has lost its reservation efficiency of skills, and Ashes might now also just be a completely useless item, depending on what the new Transfigured Gems are going to have as their qualities. We'll have to see here, but it is completely losing its reservation efficiency of skills. Heat Shiver has also been completely gutted. Instead of it giving you 100% extra cold as fire, is now only 30%, meaning Heat Shiver is now 70% weaker. Lastly, Calm Spirit is just not a pair of gloves anymore. Instead of you gaining 1 rage per 100 life recovery, it's now 1 rage per every 300 life recovery, meaning it is now 3 times worse than it previously was. These are all very, very meta-defining items, and it's very sad to see just how heavy-handed the nerfs on all 3 of them were. If you're planning a build that was going to use any of these 3 items, please do be aware of how much they're going to be nerfed and do plan accordingly. Lastly, the only important one to mention here is Ralakesh. Ralakesh is being reworked a little bit to make it so you don't lose all of the charges it gives you when you move, as well as it not giving you your minimum as your maximum charges anymore, but now instead makes it so you count as having maximum of each charge instead. This functionally shouldn't change anything. What I believe this means is that it's just stopping the abuse of you being able to put on Ralakesh and then take them off while keeping the frenzy charges and the power charges. But we'll see what this means, and I think GGG might want to clarify this a little bit more. If not, we'll see what actually means once we get in game. That is all that there really is for the patch notes. I just wanted to very quickly talk about all the major points that will apply to most people. Overall, I feel like most of the skills are getting buffed by quite a large amount, and I feel like a lot of skills are going to be in a very good spot now. I know I only briefly touched maybe 10% of all the skill changes, and there's quite a lot of other small skill changes here and there that just overall basically buff most of the skills in game. I'm very happy with the outcome of this patch notes, and I'm very excited to play Ultimatum again. I'm excited to interact with the new Ascendancies nodes, and I'm excited to see what GG is going to do with Transfigured Gems. I have high hopes for the season. I have high hopes that this is going to be one of the most fun seasons I've ever played at PoE, and I'm excited to make as many guides and as many videos about all the new discoveries as we find them throughout the season. That's all I have for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. I'll see you guys in the next video.